The Evil Dead franchise is one of the most well-known and influential franchises in the horror genre, with the legacy so strong that not only are we getting our 6th official film installment with Evil Dead Burn, but we already have our 7th installment, Evil Dead Wrath, currently in production. And looking at how humble the beginnings of this franchise were, it's truly impressive that over the last 40 plus years, we've gotten everything from movies, comics, video games, toys, and even 3 seasons of what I consider to be one of the best horror TV shows of all time. So how did 2 childhood friends from Michigan, a $1,600 short film, some very patient investors, and one freezing cold ass cabin in the middle of Tennessee create one of the most influential horror movies of all time? This is the history of Sam Raimi's masterpiece, The Evil Dead. The original Evil Dead was released on October 15th of 1981, and it does serve as Sam Raimi's directorial debut. The story follows 5 college friends, Cheryl, Linda, Shelley, Scott, and the now infamous Ash Williams. The group goes to a remote cabin in the woods for a vacation, and while they're at their cabin, they discover this ancient book and a weird tape recorder in the basement. It reads this mysterious text out loud, but little do they know, the words that they hear on that tape unleashes dormant and malevolent spirits that possess each of the students one by one, and those spirits went on to be known as the Deadites. It was a fairly low budget film that was pretty much made almost guerrilla style. All the special effects were either practical or done through stop motion, and the film was made in a very harsh environment. But if you think that this is actually where things got started, you would have to go back a couple years. More specifically to the year 1978, because many people believe that 1981's The Evil Dead was the first installment in the franchise, when in actuality, that's not the case, because the story of The Evil Dead truly starts with a childhood friendship. Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell both met as kids growing up in Royal Oak, Michigan. One of the things they really loved to do together was make little short films, little backyard projects, silly comedies, and one day when they were in the backyard shooting a suspense scene for one of their comedies, something clicked inside of Sam Raimi's mind. He realized that he could take that tension and crank it up to a whole nother level. So Sam and Bruce, along with their now producer Rob Tapper, they formed what would be called Renaissance Pictures. Now these boys wasn't rich, like at all, and they were not connected to Hollywood in any kind of way. They were just 3 dudes from Michigan, and all they had was a dream, a camera, and a whole lot of audacity for trying to do any of this without a single dime to their name. But the most important thing that they did have was chemistry, and that chemistry ended up being the secret sauce that made the Evil Dead movie as great as it was. Now, with absolutely no money at all, there was no way that they were going to get anything filmed or even submitted so they could raise funds. That was when Sam Raimi raised $1,600 and wrote the 32-minute short film called Within the Woods. And Within the Woods served as the basis for what the Evil Dead movie would eventually become. Sam Raimi wrote, directed, and edited the short film, and it was completed in 1979. They shot it over 1 weekend in a remote cabin somewhere in northern Michigan. Bruce Campbell was in the film, of course, their friend Ellen, who eventually played Cheryl in the full Evil Dead movie, Scott Spiegel, and Mary Valentine. And the plot of Within the Woods is basically the same plot as the Evil Dead, but in a much more shorter version. And this is actually when Sam Raimi introduced his infamous demon camera pan thing. And those POV shots that Sam Raimi came up with in Within the Woods became his staple throughout the rest of his career. When Sam was in school, he had a literature assignment about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. He blended that with your typical undead zombie horror vibes and basically came up with the concept. They screened Within the Woods publicly for the first time in August of 1979 at the Punch and Judy Theater in Detroit. And the audience reacted exactly how you'd hope. Screaming, laughing, and enough excitement that Sam and the guys knew that they had something special on their hands. It was basically proof to investors saying that, hey, you know, look what we can do with almost no money. If we can create this with barely a dime to our name, imagine what we could do if we had a little more money in our pocket. And I'm pretty sure you can guess by now, it worked. It was a major success for what it was. With the short film complete, they started hitting up investors, mostly lawyers and local businesses around Detroit, and they eventually raised about $90,000. Then they kept on trying to raise money through multiple rounds of private funding until the total budget eventually reached roughly $375,000. Now, even though that's a 6-figure number, that number was still pretty tiny by Hollywood standards. But to them, it felt like a fortune. I mean, you know, having $375,000 versus the $1,600 that you started with, that's a pretty big jump. And the original title for the film was actually The Book of the Dead, which was once again inspired by Sam Raimi's literature class. The original title sounded mysterious and it didn't sound silly or campy, so they figured that it would be a way for investors to take them seriously. But when they finally got a distributor for the film, that distributor being Irvin Shapiro, he absolutely hated it. He told them straight up, and I quote, "People are gonna think that they're gonna have to read for 90 minutes straight. Come up with something else or we're not gonna move forward." The team started to throw out some of the wildest names that you probably have never heard of. Names like Blood Flood, 101% Dead, which might very well be the worst horror movie title I've ever heard of in my life. That was when Shapiro finally said, "Hey man, why don't we just call it The Evil Dead?" Pretty on the knows, but that title change ended up being the greatest decision that they ever made. Sam and Bruce both hated that name, and they actually fought hard against it, even though they eventually did lose. That is one L that I'm glad they took, because The Evil Dead is one of the most recognizable names in all of horror. Now it's time to really get down to business, and this right here is when one of the wildest production stories in all of horror movies starts, bro. The making of The Evil Dead was pure production hell. Principal photography for The Evil Dead started in late 1979, early 1980. Now, they originally wanted to shoot it in Michigan, just like Within the Woods, but the Michigan Film Commission wasn't very helpful. Tennessee, on the other hand, basically rolled out the red carpet. So they headed south to a real remote cabin in the woods outside of Morristown, Tennessee. The cabin was very small, and it was actually pretty abandoned. It only had 5 rooms, and it sat on a heavily wooded property several miles away from any other buildings. But when they started filming this movie, things got brutal almost immediately. They had a 13-person crew who basically lived inside the cabin during the entire shoot. No running water. People were going days without bathing, and they eventually started getting sick. And to make matters even worse, it was freezing cold. Bruce Campbell even later on said that after long days of shooting, with his shirt being covered in all that fake blood, that he would hang the shirt up to dry, and it would be so cold that the fake blood would literally solidify and freeze within the shirt's fabric, and it would cause the shirt to break in half. If that's not production hell, bro, I don't know what is. Now, they planned to film this movie over the course of 6 weeks, but it eventually ended up stretching out to about 12 weeks. And by the end, they were burning furniture to stay warm. Arguments broke out amongst the crew consistently from all the stress and the exhaustion. That $375K that they had for the film basically ran out. And in order to get more funds, Bruce Campbell actually put up his own family's property in northern Michigan as collateral so they could get the film finished, and so they can get it blown up to 35mm for a theatrical release. That just really goes to show you how committed these dudes were. Now, because they couldn't afford like fancy equipment, and with this being the early 80s, and I mean early 80s, like 1980, there definitely was no CGI, wasn't no VFX, none of that. And that lack of equipment basically meant that Sam had to hold the camera himself. Sam Raimi essentially perfected the now legendary shaky cam technique. He would strap the camera to a piece of wood and literally sprint through the woods like a madman to create the POV of the evil force flying around. It looks chaotic and extremely cheap until it suddenly became a terrifying effect, and is now one of the most infamous shots in all of horror. Now, there were some special effects, and all those special effects were handled by the incredibly talented Tom Sullivan, and those effects were all practical, and they were all done on a shoestring budget. The gore effects definitely look homemade by today's standards, but that low budget look gave it a nasty and kind of disgusting quality that honestly CGI still can't match. And then there's the infamous tree scene, a scene that in 1981 was extremely controversial. Ellen Sandweiss, who played Cheryl, had to endure one of the most physically and emotionally demanding sequences ever put on film at that budget level, and it's still one of the most talked about moments in horror history, and it was all done practically with zero safety nets. But if you think the pain that they endured on set ends there, you'd be wrong. There's a lot more to talk about, more specifically the makeup and prosthetics that they had to wear. For example, the actors who were playing the Deadites had to wear these big bulky facial prosthetics, and the harsh adhesives that they used to apply them were damn near impossible to remove. The removal process was so tough on the skin that one of the actresses, Betsy Palmer, actually ripped off a good majority of all of her eyelashes. And because the movie was shot out of sequence over such a long period of time, the crew members had to spend up to 45 minutes making sure that all the new drips and splashes perfectly matched up with what had already been filmed. And because the budget was so low, there was no way for them to like replay everything, so they pretty much just kind of had to guess where they left off at. And let's not get into the eye strain and the pain and the temporary blindness of those contacts. 4 of the possessed actors were wearing these scleral contacts, and they were made of this hard, thick glass. And because they covered the entire eye, the lenses essentially blinded the actors, and they were incredibly painful to remove. After shooting for 12 weeks in this terrible situation, the movie was finally complete. The filming part, at least, was complete, but there's still this thing called post-production. Post-production also costs money and takes time. So if you think the nightmare ended after those 12 weeks, you'd be sadly mistaken. After wrapping, they still had to finish the movie and get everything fully together. That includes editing, sound design, optical effects, and all of it was still done with that same DIY spirit. But they were able to get everything finished and complete, and the film had its first public screening on October 15th, 1981 at the Redford Theater in Detroit. And the box office was pretty modest. It was around $2.4 million domestically, but on that $375,000 budget, that's a pretty good return. But the real magic happened in the VHS market, because word of mouth spread like wildfire about this movie, and horror fans discovered it at every local mom and pop video store that you could find. And fans fans immediately became obsessed with this movie. Now, the critics, on the other hand, as I'm pretty sure should be no surprise to anybody, were very on the fence about it. Some called it too gory and too silly and amateurish. Meanwhile, other critics recognized the raw talent. They praised the inventive direction that they had, and they got a lot of props for being able to create what they created with such a low budget. But in the UK, it became one of the infamous quote-unquote video nasties. But see, none of that stopped it from becoming a genuine cult phenomenon. Now, what Sam, Bruce, and Rob and their tiny little crew pulled off with almost no money is honestly still mind-blowing in 2026. They proved that you don't need a big studio to make something that feels massive and terrifying. And that one little movie ended up launching 3 major careers. They basically invented the cabin in the woods subgenre. And they gave us one of our very first final boys with Ash Williams, who would eventually go on to be an icon himself. But the practical effects, the inventive camera work, the commitment of the cast and the crew, and that perfect mix of genuine dread with a little bit of dark humor, it all started with this movie. Now, one of the most underrated things that a creative person can receive for something that they made is a huge cosign. And in the case of Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and the Evil Dead, they got one hell of a cosign from the legendary Stephen King. Because when the Evil Dead had a screening at the Cannes Film Festival, Stephen King saw it, and Stephen King's review of the film ended up being the quote that you see on the film's movie poster when he said, "The most ferociously original film of the year." And Stephen King also stated that The Evil Dead is his 5th favorite horror film of all time. The Evil Dead was also met with some controversies in other countries. Germany banned The Evil Dead when it came out, and I mean banned it to hell. Like, the movie didn't get unbanned until 2016. To this day, the original Evil Dead from 1981 is unrated in the United States. However, back in the day when it first got released on VHS and even on some streaming platforms today, the film is actually listed as NC-17. But despite the controversies, the hellish production schedule, the name changes, and the budget restrictions, The Evil Dead became one of the most legendary horror films of all time. It became a true staple of not just the 80s, but the undead and possession subgenre as a whole, and eventually went on to create one of the most consistent horror franchises ever created. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the complete origin story of The Evil Dead from 1981. From a $1,600 weekend short film to a movie that's still scaring and inspiring people nearly 45 years later. And if you've never seen the original for some godforsaken reason, do yourself a favor and go watch it. It holds up way better than it has any right to be honest. And even though Sam Raimi hasn't directed an Evil Dead movie since Army of Darkness in '93, and since Ash Williams hasn't been in an Evil Dead project since Ash vs. Evil Dead, both Sam and Bruce continue to be a part of this franchise by serving as executive producers. And that's probably why, even though we don't see their involvement on camera directly, the true nature and spirit of what the Evil Dead franchise is will continue to live on. So y'all drop a comment below and tell me, what is your favorite moment from the Evil Dead? Also tell me, what's your favorite Evil Dead movie in the franchise? Because the history doesn't just stop here. In the next installment, we will be discussing the greatest horror movie sequel of all time, 1987's Evil Dead 2. And if you think this story was crazy, then strap in, because that one gets a little wild too. If you enjoyed this deep dive into horror movie history, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one, because we definitely got plenty more coming, and I can't wait to drop the next one. You already know who it is. It's your boy Stoner the Great. Appreciate y'all for rocking with me, and whatever you do, don't read from that book, because I would hate to see one of y'all turn out like Ash and them in that cabin.